Robert hosts the fastest 2 hours of healing information on the radio, dealing with everyday health issues from the perspective of an alternative, holistic healthcare. He tackles the tough issues and shows no fear when confronting government and corporate bullies who would stand in the way of health freedom. Robert has personally overcome numerous chronic diseases using the natural healing principles, and has dedicated his life to revealing the healing power within all of us. And as a well-known and respected member of the health community, has access to fantastic guests from every specialty and practice to better equip our listeners. Robert Scott Bell.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you.
Take all these notes.
Yeah. You know, talking with Kristen about getting this one set up, I mean, it was a real struggle. It's like, could we even have an event, right? Were they going to, lock down everything? So this is the most awesome protest I've ever attended. You loving it? Yeah. Just in case they come in and say we need to, we're protesting for sure. I would be protesting the germ theory if I were you, because the belief in that, which we'll talk about, may be the number one reason why we're in the trouble we're in today regarding lockdowns, fear of the germ, etc., forced vaccinations, etc. And I had grown up not knowing what I know, not even close to what I know today, having now been a homeopath for about 30 years, and I wasn't raised this way. I was raised pharmautically, allopathically in a medical family. So today we'll talk about the smackdown of the centuries, the law of the terrain versus the germ theory. Just so you know, I was grown pharmaceutically. I had many ailments and illnesses. The things that are all too commonplace among the millennials and post-millennials were not common in Gen X when I was first coming onto the planet. But I had pretty much all of those things that many of these kids do today, and it's become commonplace instead of an anomaly. Other than menstrual cramps, I haven't experienced those. Thankfully not, but any of y'all know what those are, So we'll go into this statement. Now, a buddy of mine from Ogden, I didn't know him, but he was a big fan of the Robert Scott Bell Show for many years. He started sending me these cartoon images of myself with quotes. I'm like, who said that? He said, Robert, you said that. I did? I didn't even remember saying this stuff. Of course, if you do a show 2 hours plus a day for 6 days a week and been on the air for 21 years, you'll forget a lot of things that you say. So he would send me these things. I'm like, oh, that's pretty good. I might have to use that. So you're going to see a few of these cartoons pop up through the lecture today. And this one by Cognitive Dissonance, you shall be manipulated, controlled, enslaved, vaccinated, and drugged. We have been become a product of, anybody study philosophy in college, Hegel, the Hegelian dialectic, right? You have you have a problem, a reaction, a solution. It's like we're being manipulated to fight against something that we wouldn't normally need to fight against, except that it's artificially induced. We're divided along any number of lines. Politically is the most obvious right now, whether it be left-right dialectics or Republican and Democrats. But of course, as we see here in Utah County where this is happening, that dialectic is put within a Republican Party even, where we see that within that party there are all kinds of differences and distinctions. The question is, what do we make of it? What do we do with it? Can we get beyond it? Can we dissolve this dialectic in our lives so we're not manipulated by this? Thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis by those who want to manipulate us. So having grown up in a pharmaceutical family, being drugged most of my life, certainly vaccinated, although not to the level at which they vaccinate children today if they're not awake and aware like you guys are. I wonder, in fact, how anybody makes it out of childhood. Back when I was a kid, we were still getting the smallpox vaccine. Y'all remember that one? Anybody remember that? Variolinum, we call that. I fell asleep on my arm after the pox popped out of my arm, and it revaccinated the temple of my forehead. And as a little child, I remember just brutal pains. I couldn't move my head. My eyes, in fact, I couldn't move my eyes without excruciating pain for a time. And a kid, you'd wake up and you'd jump out of bed, and it's like suddenly I'm in excruciating pain. And this was after that vaccination. So I had that experience long before I knew any of these things. There was no knowledge of homeopathy in my family. As I said, we're a medical family. And it wasn't until 19 or so years of age at Major Research University in Atlanta, where I was wanting to become a medical doctor. A doctor's the only doctor I knew, only thing I had as far as a model going forward. And I always wanted to be a healer since I was a little tyke. And I realized at that point that they didn't know what they were doing. They continually drugged me for things. I had allergy shots for over 10 years. I had surgery to open up the holes of my nose larger because I couldn't breathe through my nose. And a strange thing that happened with that is after the nose was bigger, well, actually the holes were bigger, all that snot I had before, it just filled those bigger holes. It just didn't work. And of course the shots didn't work, the drugs didn't work. I felt fatigued all of the time. And I know one of the scariest places that I've ever lectured are high schools today. And not because of strange violence and scary things like that, but you see kids who should be bouncing off the walls with energy in the prime of their life, falling asleep on their desk at 10 in the morning or in the middle of the afternoon. And I thought, this is the scariest thing I've ever seen, except that it was scary to me because it was a reflection of my own youth, because that's where I was before I knew that was not normal. It became normal, but it's not a healthy normal. And so a lot of what I didn't know, I had to learn the hard way. And I think this is one of the greatest lessons in my life looking back, I didn't know it at the time, is that all of the suffering I went through, and my suffering was mine, it's not better or worse or anything like that, it's, whatever it is, it's yours. It brought me to a place where I was open enough to take a leap into a whole new realm of healing, of health. And of course that became homeopathy, a word that I didn't hear uttered in my life until I was 24 years of age. So as the doctor said at 19, we don't know why you're sick, we don't know why you have allergies, just keep taking our drugs, our shots and such. I realized I'm done. And if they went to all of the training that they went to, high-level medical doctors, and they didn't know why I was sick and they kept drugging me as if I was going to get better, what was I to conclude at a certain point? And that was when I left, and again, 5 years or so later, when answer to prayers was not the lightning bolt from the sky and miraculous healing, but I met a homeopathic doctor who emigrated from Belgium and began to teach me about what was really wrong. And he took one look at me within a few minutes and said, your liver is toxic. Your liver is toxic. And then he started describing everything about my whole medical history from the time I was a baby. I just met the guy. Through his broken English, I said, I hope you understand. I said, are you a psychic? And he laughed. He's like, he apparently knew what those were. He said, no, I'm not a psychic, I'm a homeopath. And that was scarier to me at the moment, because I didn't know what that was. But he began to talk to me about health and healing, things I learned in high school biology. It's like, wow, that makes sense. Can you clean up your liver? Can you clean up your diet? Can you go organic? All the things that I began to do and put it to the test, and I began to get energy back, strength back, symptoms of allergies went away, on and on and on. 2 years of intense work. I had overcome most of what I experienced for the previous 24 years of my life. Still, there's always work to be done. And I realized at a certain point, if I didn't know this, none of my peers knew this, how are we going to ever make it? Because if I had been ill at that point for 24 years of my life, knowing what I know of my elders, who preceded me, obviously, who some had died of cancer and neurological diseases, Parkinson's even, in their 70s and sometimes 80s. And what I knew of their childhood is that they were healthy when they were kids. I was not. I thought, I'm not going to make it to my 40s. And if I do, I will be ravaged with any number of diseases, including cancer, and then come to find out that people don't die of cancer, mostly in America, they die of the treatment for it. Right? So this was another aspect of the discovery. So all of these things lead me back to the law of the terrain, and again, the germ theory. I grew up afraid of germs, just like many of us that didn't know any better. If somebody sneezed, we were scared we were going to catch it. There were movies like Outbreak. I think that was Dustin Hoffman. I remember one of the scenes where you're in a movie theater, somebody sneezes, and they follow the germs all the way through the movie theater, and everybody inhales it. And of course, everybody died, or did they, or would they in real life? So we're going to get into some of that. So I'm going to talk some of the fundamental philosophy of these theories, if you will. And then the latter half of the lecture, I'm going to go more into, I guess, procedure and protocol. Because for me as a homeopath and someone who's dedicated to bringing the power to heal back where it belongs with each and every one of you, if I don't teach you something about how you can do what I did or even greater, I will feel like I have not done my job. So we're going to start there, and then we'll end with this is what you can do to restore integrity to your terrain. Now, this is a guy I wish we could erase him from history, but not so we'd forget. Just that if he didn't happen, millions and millions, we say hundreds of millions of billions of people wouldn't have died since the time this guy was alive. Louis Pasteur. Pasteurization, everybody knows about him. He stole a lot of his ideas from a contemporary of his. I'll get into that. But he basically said the germ is what causes disease. In other words, if you get into contact with something that causes it, you're going to get it, right? I sneeze, you come into contact with it, oh, you're toast, right? And he was at the time of Antoine Béchamp, the guy that we didn't learn about, we should have. And Robert Koch, or Koch, if you call it, he was also in Germany, a scientist that took this idea and put it into something called the Koch's postulates. But the interesting thing about history, and even in a contemporary sense, it's not always about what you know, but it's about who you know. You ever heard of that? It's about who you know. If you're friends with the emperor, and you could be wrong, but you're friends with the emperor, then what the emperor says goes, and he says you're right. And so that's the kind of context in Pasteur's time, being buddies with the emperor there in France versus Béchamp, who wasn't. I'm going to get into Béchamp in a moment, but the germ theory, the mere presence of or contact with a pathogen, you call it a disease-causing microorganism, results in disease. That's it, okay? If it were accurate, we've got some questions about that. So let's go through what's known as Koch's postulates. Apparently they don't matter anymore in the era of COVID crazy, but they haven't mattered in a long time in the era of HIV crazy. And I bring this up simply because since they claimed a retrovirus could kill you over initially 6 months, then it was a year, then it was 2 years, then it's 10 years, then it's 24 years, and you got Magic Johnson who's still alive, and suddenly it's like, what is really happening here? And they didn't have, when applied, these postulates to that any more than they do to this COVID crazy thing that we're dealing with. Koch's postulates, the microorganism that they say is the cause of whatever it is, infection, should be found in abundance in the organism or human or animal that's suffering. Now, in the case of COVID, I have yet to find one claim that they have found copious amounts of this virus swimming around the bodily fluids of any victims, alive or dead, suffering or otherwise. That, to my knowledge, has not happened, and I think that would be one of those basic starting points, and they didn't even get that. Then you must, let's say, isolate that microorganism from the diseased tissue or organism and grow it in culture. And then the third, you must take that culture and introduce it into something or someone that's healthy, and they should also get sick, and then you then isolate it from that victim, if you will. Okay, so these are some basic principles that were considered. This is the gold standard to identify and isolate and go, this is it, this is the thing that caused it in all these people. Okay? But it's been abandoned. Big time, it's been abandoned. Now, if we talk about the germ theory, as we do right now, as I am right now, we recognize that yes, you can isolate certain bacteria from your body. In fact, if we were to do a different kind of swab, like instead of in your sinus cavity, the back of your throat, and put it on a petri dish to see what grows there, it's a very high likelihood that we would have 100% positivity in that growth cell medium culture for Streptococcus bacteria. All of us, right now. Show of hands, anybody now currently suffering from a strep throat infection? I've had plenty of them in my young life. Anybody have that right now, strep throat? Okay. So there's a problem here with already this germ theory. The mere presence of or contact with is not sufficient. And I can go into other aspects of your body, not to be gross, but your colon. Okay? What will we find there? A lot of things. You might even find, in fact you will, different strains of Candida, whether it's Candida albicans or other forms. Now, no show of hands here because it's a much more common overgrowth, but chances are the vast, vast majority of us are not suffering from an overgrowth of Candida albicans right now, yet it is in every one of us right now as well. And so the point is we can even find E. coli in our gastrointestinal tracts. And usually in the news media, when you hear about E. coli, they talk about deadly E. coli. And it's like, wait a second, if it's in us all, how come we're not all dead? And that's a good question, because if the germ theory were accurate, there would be nobody alive today to discover it, much less promote it. I want you to think about that, because we have enough things, germs if you want to call it, in our bodies, on us, around us, every aspect in the air right now floating around us, that there is no explanation for human or animal life, period. It's over, done. We're all just here, it's pretend. Just imagine we just sold t-shirts for $1,100. That's crazy, right? That didn't happen. Well, that did happen. And we are here, we are alive, and we're breathing, and we're exchanging microbiome. We're exchanging what we call virome. If we talk about the gastrointestinal tract alone, we have more bacteria than we have human or animal cells, human and mammalian cells. It's not even close. Sometimes said 10 to 1. And if we go into the virome, now we're talking about these little proteins that are not life forms necessarily. You can have amino acid sequences. They talk RNA or whatever that they're doing with the COVID. And yet we're talking trillions and quintillions. There are ratios that are staggering to consider, not just in you and right on you, but floating around us right now. And so, of course, that's another aspect of the absurdity of masking. Not the least of which the problem is, a mask with its fabric or any form that they have is like asking a chain link fence to stop a mosquito. You've heard that. And that's from a physical standpoint, that's true and accurate. But even if you were to trap some in mucus, for instance, is their argument. Well, if it's stuck in the mucus, it's going to be stuck in your mask, and then you get to breathe it right back in, etc. It's just nonsense. And so what we're doing is taking something that is a normal part of the environment or the terrain and calling it a villain or a supervillain, that we must be in a permanent state of fear because we can never truly escape it. And so the germ theory is a fear-based viewpoint on life itself. It's a way of life that embraces fear as a permanent state. Now, some of you have heard about something called the Bible. Maybe one or two, right? And the spiritual texts of our planet and the people on it have written extraordinary stories and shared their experiences. I don't recall one of those Psalms or anything say, you must live in fear. Don't breathe too deeply. Mask, right? Teach your children to fear one another. Teach your children that you, as a parent, are a vector of their demise, potentially, and that they are a vector of your demise. How is this not a demonic thing that we're not calling out every day? That this is being argued as something scientific and legitimized. It is anti-human. So once again, Pasteur believed we became ill because of these germs that are in us, around us, all around us, and including these things called viruses, which they didn't know what they were. In fact, I always find it a little absurd that they claim that they know what killed everybody in 1918. Ever heard of the Spanish flu? I looked into that, and they dug up apparently a dead guy in Alaska who got frozen, and so he was preserved pretty well some, 20 years later or something, or longer than that. And they dug up and they found out stuff in him, and they said, oh, look, we see this thing, it must have been the thing. We found the cause of everybody's death, all those millions of people that died around the world. We found it in a dead guy in Alaska. And nobody challenged that. Nobody said, how did you come to that conclusion? They didn't even know of viruses. They didn't have electron microscopes back at the time, and then they find, it's so absurd. But we have been taught, unfortunately, to bow down and worship at the feet of those with authority. If they have the white lab coats and the stethoscope, or if they're PhDs, suddenly we're supposed to say they know something we don't know. And I refer to them as the priestcraft in the church of pharmaceutical mysticism. Yes. This is a cult. Modern medicine, God bless them for some of the advancements they made in surgical, life-saving interventions, putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. But beyond that, it's a warfare mentality with the body. It's attack, it's kill, so that you can survive. And I don't know, there was that point where I woke up and said, my gosh, this is absurd. I believe this stuff. And there's a point maybe you've already come to where you say, this is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. How has anybody believed this stuff? And I'm embarrassed for doctors and PhD scientists who continue to push this on us if it's actually legitimate and real and validated. The idea that the germ causes disease. So, Béchamp, this is the guy we should have learned about. Now, as I lectured around the world, I often talk to doctors, ask them, have you ever heard of Antoine Béchamp? American doctors, never. Very rarely, if ever, unless they've come out of it and woken up, but no, never. In Europe, they still learn a little bit about the law of the terrain and Béchamp. But if you're a doctor here in America, you probably never heard of Antoine Béchamp. This book, Béchamp or Pasteur, is a great text to read and learn. And a contemporary of Béchamp was Claude Bernard, a French physiologist, and I studied him as well as I became a homeopath to learn about the law of the terrain, to transform my worldview from one of fear and victimhood to one who can walk through life in the midst of the scariest fear porn of COVID 2020 and just laugh in their face. I'd spit, but I don't want to scare them, so I'll just laugh. But it's really, really amazing and disgusting that we're at this point in time where so many of us, present company accepted, have bought this lie, have bought these belief systems that are completely and utterly in violation of what we learn if we go to church once a week or twice a week or whatever, or if you go to synagogue or temple or wherever you go. So what is the law of the terrain then? Béchamp, Bernard, the terrain, the milieu. Anybody speak good French here? Because I don't. Inspector Clouseau would do it better. The milieu, is that the milieu? Or the environment determines health or disease, not the pathogen. And that germs aren't the cause of disease, they're the result of disease. In other words, they're always there. And then suddenly you go, whoa, we find a lot of that right now, it must have caused your problem, right? Strep throat infection, Streptococcus bacteria, it caused the problem. But if strep was always there, how did it suddenly cause the problem? They go, you know what? 7 o'clock on a Tuesday, I think I'm going to annoy Robert Scott Bell and just going to grow outside and go crazy, right? He was partying on the weekend, now it's our turn, right? I mean, where does this? This is where we personify these things as if they have this idea or an agenda that I just want to annoy somebody right now, or I want to take somebody out. Is that how it works? Germs aren't the cause of disease; they are the result. Right? It's one of those moments where you go, "What the heck did I just hear? My whole life I've been told germs cause disease," and no, they're the result of the imbalance that occurs when we pollute, when we intoxicate, when we remove things from the environment that belong there, like a good farmer, a good soil. Where's Caleb? Is he here? Oh, he left. I want him up here instead of me. He would talk about the law of the terrain. Anybody, any good farmer, organic farmer, would know all of this just because they observe it in nature. Here comes one of those quotes. Cancer is not a random act of God, it's an insane act of man. The fact that we think we can put toxic chemicals into the soil, the air, the water, and not have a consequence, and not destroy our children or grandchildren. I mean, this is the height of irresponsibility, immaturity. Caleb mentioned glyphosate. How many of you live in neighborhoods and your neighbors are still using Roundup? Yeah, probably all of us. And you want to grab and go, what are you doing? But you got to be nice about it, I understand. But like when Andy let out an epithet, I feel it. I was feeling you, Andy. I'm like, I'm with you. I don't like to cuss. I can't do it on the air, but there's a certain point where you're like, oh man, I can't believe what's happening here. What has happened? And you want to, maybe for effect, will it wake somebody up? Okay, we'll use it. But we're at a point now where the idea of chronic disease is a little bit, I guess, different than acute disease and infection, which they've already abandoned Koch's postulates because they're claiming that this COVID-19 thing is an acute infection of some kind. Yet it only kills people who are on multiple medications, on death's door already in nursing homes. Comorbidities, they call it. Multiple ailments and illnesses have already been diagnosed, and they say, well, that's the thing that did it. And of course, we heard the CDC reclassified, said only 6% of the deaths count is only considered to be a COVID death. But even then, I dispute that, because their basis for making the claim is what? We took a sample of unknown genetic material from the back of their sinus cavity, and we went and used this powerful amplification technology called polymerase chain reaction, and we amplified it doubling every time we run the cycle, every cycle. So 1 to 2, 2 to 4, you double it every time. By the time you've run 30 cycles, you're well over million times amplified. If you run 40 cycles, you're into the trillions and quintillions. Everybody tests positive. And some of you already know this. The founder, the developer, the inventor of PCR, Kerry Mullis, won the Nobel Prize. He said this is not a tool appropriate to identify infectious agents. It's just not. It's a manufacturing tool or technique. And yet we've based cases. Oh, another case has popped up. Well, how many cycles did you run? I didn't know that mattered. Well, sure it does, because everybody's negative at a certain level. Everybody's positive at a certain level. And there is no standard. It's on the market via FDA, not approval, but emergency use authorization. It's an emergency. But to allopathic medicine, every ailment or illness or symptom is an emergency. And God bless them, but allopathic physicians believe you can poison the body back to health. I don't know. I got a problem with that. I was a victim of that for much of my young life. Drug. Shots, even surgery. Again, everything. If you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you're trained in pharmacology and pharmacognosy and drug therapy, this is going back, by the way, in my book that I wrote with my buddy Ty Bollinger, Unlock the Power to Heal, I go into the basis for how we got here, at least one of the bases, the Flexner Report of 1910. Everybody know about Abraham and Simon Flexner? We should know about them more than Orville and Wilbur Wright, because these guys are also responsible for a lot of deaths because they went into medical schools, preordained commission report by the Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations to establish one form of medicine in America and then around the world to eliminate all competition to the emerging field of petrochemical patent medicine. And so they went after the homeopaths and the naturopaths and the eclectic herbalists and the chiropractors, and on it went. Anybody who was a vital force type of teaching had to be eliminated, because when you understand the vital force, when you understand the spirit and how that imbues us with life and that heals us, then suddenly you have less and less of a need, perceived or in reality, for a toxic patented chemical made from petrochemicals, in fact. And so we've gone astray, very far astray. And this is also why I say the most dangerous thing you can have in America is really good medical insurance. It annoys me when people say, gosh, we just need to have universal health care. First of all, define health care, because we don't have that in this system as it exists. And you want to make it so we have to participate in the third leading cause of death, which I argue is the second or first leading cause of death, because what most doctors do contributes to cancer and heart disease. So we're warped to believe that, oh man, if only the government would cover this insurance that we can't afford anymore. As opposed to, how about growing your own food in your backyard like we learned Kayla to do? How about making the food your medicine? Now, I'm going to go into where the terrain, our physical body, our terrain is damaged, some of the things, and want to go into the protocols to remediate that, what I've learned over the years, because it took me 2 full intense years of working with homeopathic medicine and going organic and doing a lot of different things in order to recover from 24 years of chronic illnesses in my life. Now, I'm just my own example, but the principles are sound and you can apply to yourself, and I want to share that with you in the time we have together as well. But many of you are already skilled and schooled in some of the things I've shared with you. And maybe you have something you want to add or a nuance to it, because even in a 50-minute lecture, it's not enough time to really go all in on the law of the terrain versus the germ theory. But I wanted to plant some principles and the philosophy of this so you understand what I'm talking about, and then you can go dig deeper. So anybody want to add anything? Germ theory, law of terrain experience. Yes?
Germ theory, I thought it was interesting when the pandemic came out. I came across the scripture in the Bible. And it was the ones who held themselves as righteous. They said, Jesus, why aren't you washing your hands? He was by the river and they're about to eat. And he said, we don't need to. It's not what goes in that defiles us. It's what comes out.
That's beautiful, yeah. So, have you seen a lot of the people that are using, what would Jesus do? Would he wear a mask? They're like, if you're really, I'm like, really? He was in with the lepers? I mean, this is an argument too? Really? I'm like, go back to Sunday school, whatever it is you used to learn, and go back and learn it again because you missed it somehow. But that again, being in fear, living in fear, this is not of God in my opinion. This is a Luciferian agenda to cause us to live in a permanent state of fear of one another. How do we love and uplift and serve and be living examples for God and spirit when we are in fear of one another, or teaching our children to be in fear of one another? This is why it's so horrific Was it the 17th was Constitution Day? And my daughter goes to, I love the school she goes to, but Governor Herbert said, oh my gosh, it's getting really bad in Utah County. And suddenly the school had to comply with a stupid edict, and they said, we're having Constitution Day celebration, and we're all going to be outdoors, but you have to wear a mask. And I suddenly said, I am not going to celebrate the Constitution, because the antithesis of that is to wear a mask and to mandate it. So I didn't go. But I mean, these are the absurd things we're dealing with as, trying to be good citizens, good people. Yes, ma'am.
So a spirit of love instead of a spirit of fear. Fear feeds into the germ theory, right? Germ theory is based off of fear. And when we're filled with fear, we're not what God made us, which is resilient. And our body has the cure for all diseases within it. It does. I have a story very similar to yours, and there is no incurable disease.
Yeah, they're only incurable people with closed minds, living in fear. Yeah. Right. So some people have said what we're dealing with is spiritual warfare right now. I agree with that, even though I don't like warfare analogies. Sometimes they're apt. But if we are arguing at some level that we must live in fear of one another, is that not an attack on our spiritual essence? Our true origin with Heavenly Father, with God? I mean, this to me is so obvious. I'm like, how does anybody not see this? That if they're, of faith, that they can't see that this fear-mongering is not of God, that there's some other agenda happening here. And of course, that manifests in a lot of the things that destroy the terrain. Coming from the germ theory, the fear of the germ kind of planted a state of consciousness, if you will, that would limit our, let's say, coming back to the love and the faith and the belief that would have us out of that fear. And that was the point where we had to declare war on nature, on creation itself. Think about it. What this germ theory means. It's like God created this place and everything's here just to jump up and kill us at any moment. So suddenly now we are righteous in our war on nature. And then we develop what? More and more toxic, powerful chemicals to kill the things that we thought were going to kill us first. And, this whole idea, kill them all, let God sort them out. You hear these things going. It's like this is a mentality of war. Are we to live in a permanent state of war? How does that work? If you understand warfare in terms of the body, that's living in a permanent state of fight or flight. Now, it's good to get away. If a bear's coming at you, get in fight or flight, and everything goes to your movement. But if you live in that state permanently, you don't live a long, healthy life. We are not designed to do that on a permanent basis. And they are programming us to live in a permanent state of fight or flight. And so the self-fulfilling prophecy is that there will be a second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth wave of whatever they call it. They'll call it COVID. It's not, but it's basically living in fear. And that's what you manifest when you live in that state. Did you have a question or comment? Yes. Is that Star?
Social worker, and one of the biggest eye-openers for me is when I see my clients go on pharmaceutical or psychotropic med, and I just see such deterioration happen so quickly. Especially with, not only physically, not only mentally, but also physically. I'm wondering why those aren't up there on this list.
Yeah, I've already talked about the drugs, but psychotropics should be on the list. It's not an exhaustive list. There's only enough room on but yes, it's absolutely part of it. If you listen to my radio show, we talk about all of that, everything, all the time. So this is just a short list, if you will, of hopefully things that can make people aware of the choices that they're making. Yes?
2 seconds. In having these conversations of germ versus terrain theory with people, it's helpful to know the synonyms for terrain theories is cell theory or natural law theory.
Cell theory, natural law theory, yes.
Just so you don't get confused.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
I found that when I have conversations.
Around the world, there are different words for it. It's true. Some German New Medicine understands some of these concepts, of course, as well. Yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry, just one more thought really quickly.
Yeah.
So I love 2 Timothy 1:7, right? God has not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and love and a sound mind. If you're ever motivated by fear, it is not by God. And also the parable of the Savior with the seeds. That's right there. If they go on the rocky, it's the seeds that grow the plant, right? But do they go on the rocky soil? Do they go on the hard soil? Do they go on, they go on the good soil? So always, it's all through the scriptures. So.
Yeah. Well, and talk about parables. There are modern day parables too that cause I had to learn some of these, because we get to the point where I don't want to be righteous and use the anger that I feel, that I think is righteous anger, to harm another, right? Or to bring somebody further along than they're ready to be brought, because there's freedom, there's agency, all of that we are taught, and it's true. You know, you see a little old lady on the side of the road and you think, I'm going to help her out. You grab her by the arm and you carry her almost across the street, and she beats you with her umbrella the whole way, and you're wondering, wait a second, I'm helping you, lady, I'm getting you across the street. And then she tells you on the other side, I didn't want to go across the street. And so there is that aspect that we're dealing with as well. Many of our fellow humans that are lost right now are not prepared and ready to go across the street. So what do? Where I draw the line is when they try to keep us on their side of the street. That's also the equal and opposite thing, that they're using a violent form of interference in our lives and our freedoms. And so ultimately what we're fighting for, as much as I would argue against vaccination every day of the week and know so many ways to prevent diseases without that, I would argue, as many of you do, for the freedom to choose. That's why this is about health freedom. That's why I've done this show on health freedom for so many years.